University, USA. Prayer and Power in the Sun. 14th at 3 o'clock again, weekly seminar. Dr. Narendra Shukla, Junior Fellow at NML. Bharatiya Swatantrata Andolan और प्रतिबंधित एक अध्याय 97-1935. 15th May, 3 o'clock, public lecture in the India and the Wider World series. Professor Dave Nathan, Institute of Human Development, New Delhi and UP University. India, the Emerging Powers and the World Economy. And 16th May, again at 3 o'clock, seminar by Mr. Jovan Chawowski, doctoral candidate at Peking University. Joseph Broz teacher and Jawaharlal Nehru from distant countries to closest allies. So the talk schedule. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome amongst us Mr. Chinmaya Gharekhan. He is a very well-known diplomat of the greatest distinction and served in very responsible capacities in many parts of the world and here. Has been at the UN for very long and is a great expert on the subject, needless to say. Has published on the subject and is at present the chairman of the trust of the Indira Gandhi National Memorial, the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts. Right. But we are hearing it not on the arts, but on the UN. Is the UN still relevant today? It's interesting that the subject question has to be even posed, but a person of his background and his experience will be able to shed light on how very controversial it can be sometimes and how problematic it is to have a body of this kind and what the ins and outs of the problem are. Let me welcome Mr. Gharekhan.
Thank you, Mr. Bharat. The one thing I like about these lectures is that it gives me an opportunity to hear nice things about me. so I almost never refuse invitations. So thank you very much for the invitation. When I was first asked to give this lecture, the topic suggested was India and the United Nations. I thought it would be a rather boring subject for me as well as for whatever audience might decide to turn up for the lecture. And I must say, there are many more people than I expected. So I may have made the mistake of suggesting the topic, is the United Nations still relevant today, because it makes it a little more difficult subject. At the same time, as you said, much more interesting and much more controversial. And controversies, so long as we don't refer to various G scams, are always to be welcomed. I should say at the outset that when I will talk about the United Nations this afternoon, what I have in mind is United Nations, which is located in New York City, United States of America. I'm not going to refer to the UN family of specialized agencies, because in almost all cases, all those who justify the performance of the United Nations very often refer to the achievements of the United Nations in various other areas. International Telecommunications Union, health, labor standards, and so on. I think that each one of those specialized agencies can stand on its own. And the ILO, of course, predates United Nations by far, since it was established in 1919. But the ITU and the WHO, they were all established after the Second World War. And all those agencies do not really need the United Nations building in New York. So if the UN as such were to disappear, those agencies can still continue to function very productively. So I'm going to deal with the United Nations building or UN as represented in New York. Also, I believe that the United Nations is uniquely placed to deal with two aspects, particularly of human endeavor. One is of course, the maintenance of international peace and security, and the other is social issues. There is no international organization other than the United Nations which deals in a comprehensive manner with social issues, gender issues, torture, Convention Against Torture, protection of children, protection of minorities, HIV/AIDS. The UN is uniquely placed to tackle those issues, which it has done, I think, with a fair measure of success. But the core responsibility of the United Nations is to maintain peace and security in the world. And it is this aspect with which the peoples of the world judge the performance of the United Nations. And I think it is fair to do so, because this institution was conceived of during the Second World War and was born at the end of the war to prevent, to quote the much quoted words of the Charter, to prevent succeeding generations from the scourge of war. So I try to confine myself to this responsibility, this mandate, if you like, of the United Nations. Of course, one can immediately say that the report of the performance, the report card is a mixed one, like in all areas of human endeavor. But like Mark Antony said during his oration about Julius Caesar, the good is oft interred with the bones. The evil that men not lives after them, the good is oft interred with the bones. So here also it says, the failures will long be remembered, success is scarce, trenches. It is also useful perhaps to mention that whatever successes the United Nations has managed to achieve are claimed by the member states of the UN as theirs. That we, the members, have managed to succeed in this, that, and the other exercise. But whatever fails, wherever the United Nations fails, the failure is that of the United Nations. I think as far as the public opinion is concerned, they don't make any distinction between the body which is known as United Nations and the member states of the United Nations which make up that body. United Nations is an intergovernmental body, as we know, it's not an NGO. And so it is not unreasonable for the armed army of the world not to make any such distinction. But in the UN, where I have worked for a long time, in the corridors and conference halls of the United Nations, we do make this distinction that there is the member states on the one side, and there is the Secretary General and the officials in the Secretariat who carry out the mandates given to them by member states. As Mr. Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General with whom I worked for a few years as his senior political advisor, always used to say that one of the functions of the United Nations is to act as a scapegoat for the failures of the United Nations. And it is legitimate. I don't think one should complain about it. I think it is fair to hold the UN responsible. Now the United Nations enshrines a system of collective security, which is embodied in the Charter of the United Nations. This system of collective security implies that all the member states will join their efforts, pool their resources, financial as well as human, to maintain peace and stability in the world. But this system of collective security is premised on the existence of consensus or unanimity among great powers. And the United Nations Charter recognizes only 5 great powers, as we all know, so-called P5 permanent members. I don't need to mention them, you know them all. So it was always recognized that if there is no such unanimity among the 5, then the UN will be paralyzed, cannot function. When the San Francisco Conference in 1945, June to August, was drafting the Charter, all the participants recognized that it would not be prudent or correct to assume such big power consensus. It was always clear there in San Francisco that the UN will not be able to achieve this consensus among the 5. Sir Ramaswamy Budaliar, who was the Indian representative at the San Francisco Conference, he said that there should be no illusion that the United Nations could prevent wars between great or small nations if the great powers were divided in their sympathies. The Secretary of State of the United States at that time, Mr. Burns, he said that the functioning of the United Nations will depend not merely upon the words of its charter or the rules of procedure that we might adopt, but it will depend upon the support it receives from the governments and peoples of the nations which have created it and which must sustain it. If the United Nations lives in the minds and hearts of our peoples, it will be able to adapt itself to the changing needs of the changing world, and will endure. If it lacks broad popular support, no charter, however perfect, will save it. He also added that it is argued that great states may abuse the rights given to them under the charter, may misuse the responsibility and the authority they have got. He said that there are risks in any human endeavor, but I have confidence that the great states will respect their obligations. So this system of collective security was practically non-functional during the course of the Cold War period. We have one instance where it worked by default. That was the Korean War in the early 50s, 51, 53. And the Security Council adopted resolution declaring the North Koreans as the aggressor and authorizing the United Nations to deal with that aggression under Chapter 7 of the Charter. That resolution went through by accident. The Soviet delegate at the time decided to absent himself from the meeting of the Security Council because he protested against the presence of the Taiwan regime in the Security Council. And he said that the rightful representative should be the People's Republic of China. And so in protest he walked out. And during his absence, the Security Council quickly adopted the resolution. But this incident established a precedent, a very important precedent. The Charter says that all decisions of the Security Council which are not procedural in nature, that means all substantive decisions of the Security Council must be adopted with a majority of 9 from a total membership of 15 with the concurrence of the 5 permanent members. It says, with the concurrence of the 5 permanent members. The word veto doesn't appear anywhere in this charter. But the concurring votes implies really 5 affirmative votes of the permanent members. But the practice developed after the Soviet walkout from the Security Council, whereby an absence or an abstention by a permanent member does not amount to veto. So in theory, so long as there are 9 affirmative votes, even if only 1 permanent member votes in favor, and all the 4 others abstain, then its resolution gets through. Or even if all the 5 abstain on a resolution, but the other 10 vote in favor, even on substantive issues, then theoretically the resolution can be adopted. This has never happened in the practice of the United Nations. And after that disaster walkout by the Soviet Union, not only the permanent members, but even non-permanent members are never absent from Security Council meetings. And there is a difference which I like to point out, because when and it is a subtle difference. It is a difference with some distinction. It is this, that when a permanent member abstains on a resolution, it in effect means a yes vote or an affirmative vote. Because to say no, it must say no. But if it abstains, in effect it says yes, so it doesn't want for political reasons to say yes. Whereas the non-permanent members, like India, was until December last year, and it was during my time in the United Nations, when the non-permanent member says abstention, in effect it means no. But if no is meaningless, valueless, because it doesn't affect the outcome of the vote, result of the vote. And I can tell you from my own experience that there was many a time when I would have liked to vote against the resolution, or India would have liked to vote against the resolution. But for political reasons, we do not want to upset one or the other members of the council. Usually he is a permanent member, very often the United States of America. We do not cast a negative vote, we abstain. But in effect, we want to say that I would really have loved to vote against this resolution, but for this or that reason, I'm not doing that. Now the responsibility to maintain peace and stability is in two chapters of the Charter, Chapter 6, Chapter 7. Chapter 6 of the Charter deals with peaceful settlement of disputes. And Chapter 7, which is really crucial one, deals with peace enforcement or imposing peace in a situation of war. It's also good to remember that the Charter, first of all, does not contain the words peacekeeping anywhere in the Charter. There is no mention of peacekeeping in the Charter. And the Charter also has no provision to deal with conflict situations within a country, within a state. The Charter was devised to prevent succeeding generations from the scourge of war among nations, war between states rather than within states. So Chapter 7, which deals with enforcement measures, has no provision which can authorize the Security Council to deal with conflicts such as the one in Rwanda or the one in Somalia, which were conflict situations within a particular country. But of course, a large number of these peacekeeping operations have, in fact, since the end of the Second World War and since the end of the Cold War, have been carried out within the confines of the territorial confines of the state. I'll come to that in a little while. Chapter 6, as I said, deals with peaceful settlement. That means with the consent of the states concerned. So when India took the question of Kashmir, or Pakistan's aggression against India in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, at the end of 1947, 31st December 1947, we took it under Chapter 6 of the Charter, peaceful settlement. Some people maintain that we made a mistake by going under Chapter 6. India should have really gone under Chapter 7. I don't know, I myself don't agree with that. But whatever, I don't think we should go into that here. But we went under Chapter 6, and any settlement of that Kashmir dispute, for example, would have to be brought about with the consent of both the countries. And again, I don't want to go to the history of the Kashmir question in the United Nations. Similarly, there are other situations like, after the Arab-Israeli War of 1947-48, there were ceasefires brought about by the United Nations. And all those ceasefires then kind of crystallized into bodies of peacekeeping, peace observer missions. But they were all with the consent of Israel and the Arab states involved. But I think the real crux of maintaining peace and security is Chapter 7 of the Charter. What the United Nations, or the existence of the United Nations has done is to establish the principle of international law that force can be used between states only in two circumstances. Legitimate use of force is permissible only under two circumstances. First, there is only the right of self-defense, and second, only when the Security Council authorizes the use of force. Apart from these two circumstances, every other use of force is illegal in international law. The right of self-defense is inherent in the law of nations. Every country has the right to defend itself. But until the Charter came into being, the right of self-defense was defined or interpreted more liberally, more broadly than is permitted under the Charter. Earlier, pre-1945 Charter, states would say that I think I'm under imminent threat of use of force or of attack by another state. And so the preemptive action, the state claims the right to use force. The Charter makes it very clear the state has the right to invoke self-defense only in the event that it is actually attacked by another state. So it is greatly circumscribed, this right of self-defense. And the other, of course, is authorization by Security Council. Let me just give you one example, couple of examples where the force was used illegally in terms of current international law. The American intervention in Iraq in 2003 was not authorized by the Security Council. The Americans were extremely keen to obtain such authorization. They tried very hard, they tried all sorts of pressures. But out of 15 members, they could obtain the support of only 4 countries. This was really an unprecedented political setback for the Americans. Never before, never since have they had such humiliation in Security Council. But they went ahead anyway and used force. We all know this non-existent weapons of mass destruction and so on. So it was clearly an illegal use of force. And even a Secretary General like Mr. Kofi Annan, who was so clearly an American choice for that position, made bold to declare publicly that use of force, that intervention was illegal. Of course, it became very unpopular in the American Congress, but became popular in public opinion, especially in our countries, all our countries. And until that time, most developing countries or non-aligned countries were very, to put it diplomatically, very skeptical of Mr. Kofi Annan. But after that, the stock went up. That was one illegitimate use of force. The other was the bombardment of Kosovo in 1999. The Kosovo was a constituent unit of the Republic of Serbia in the former Yugoslavia, and everybody, the whole world recognized that Kosovo was an integral part of Serbia. But the Kosovars wanted to secede, wanted to become independent, and so on. And there was bloodshed. The Serbs were pretty ruthless. They massacred thousands of Kosovars, and vice versa. And NATO then stepped in, bombarded Kosovo and Serbia proper for I think 77 or 99 days. Again, the Americans tried to go to the Security Council, but the Russians and the Chinese had made it abundantly clear that they will veto any such resolution. And so they went ahead and did it, so it was clearly not a legal intervention. But the powers that went into Kosovo then started to make a distinction between legality and legitimacy. And they said, well, strictly speaking, maybe it was not legal, but it was a legitimate use of force. Legitimate because of the massacres that were going on. And so it was the duty of the international community step in and stop this massacre of innocent people. Again, this is the difference between the without distinction or distinction without difference. What is the correct phrase, whatever it is. So that was another instance of. Now, as far as the legitimate or legal use of force is concerned, we have many examples. Well, let me mention briefly how long will I go on? In my next lecture. Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. There are many instances. Now, let us mention the successes first. As I said, success is scarce mentioned, so let me start with successes first. Namibia, what used to be Southwest Africa, it is a very prosperous independent country today, was part of, for all practical purposes, part of South Africa. Though it was a mandate given to South Africa by the League of Nations, but South Africa claimed it as its own. And so Namibia eventually achieved its independence, largely with the help of the United Nations. Angola, the African country, Mozambique, African country, both of these were Portuguese colonies for hundreds of years. And the freedom movements, liberation movements, both of them for decades. They became independent, achieved their liberation, thanks largely to United Nations. Nearer home here, Cambodia. Remember the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia in 1979 to get rid of the Pol Pot regime. That too was an example of illegal intervention by one state in another, because it was not authorized by the Security Council, but they went ahead and did that. Just as we went ahead and intervened in East Pakistan in 1971 and helped liberate Bangladesh. I mean, the truer thing would be said, and to liberate Bangladesh, but the diplomatically more correct thing is to say helped liberate Bangladesh, because principally it was done by their own Mukti Bahini. That again was not authorized by United Nations, and in fact India was condemned by the General Assembly in a resolution which was largely supported by many of our friends in the Northern Ireland movement. They all voted against us in the General Assembly. But anyway, that's one. But after that, in Cambodia, the United Nations stepped in, organized elections, and now Cambodia, under the Pol Pot regime, was got rid of. Okay, it doesn't matter what kind of system now of things in Cambodia, whether it is a truly democratic system or not, it is debatable. The United Nations had many successes in a region with which we are not familiar at all, except perhaps some scholars in JNU or DU, etc. There is Central America. In Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and so on. The United Nations has many successes, mainly through quiet diplomacy, but also through deployment of peacekeeping missions. And Mr. Perez de Cuellar of Peru, when he was Secretary General, coming from that region, he took particular interest in Central America, and he did a wonderful job. And I think he could have been given the Nobel for that work, rather than some other successors of his. So these are the instances of some successes, but all of us have forgotten about them. So let us talk about the failures, which are at least as many, but they certainly are more remembered and perhaps more relevant for us to discuss in the context of today's subject, which is the relevance of the United Nations. I think 3 examples come to mind. Rwanda, Somalia, and former Yugoslavia, and in particular the small little village or town called Srebrenica. You probably pronounce it differently in your mind when you read this word Srebrenica, S-R-E-B-R-E-N-I-C-A, but it's pronounced as Srebrenica. I served in Yugoslavia, so I know exactly what the pronunciation is. And this is the place where 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were massacred in 1995. So these are the very huge failures of the United Nations. Let's take 3 of them briefly. Somalia. That unfortunate country has not enjoyed peace and stability for nearly 25 years now. And even though today the US, especially the United States, claims to have set up the kind of a government there, some kind of a democratic election, and there's a president and a high court and so on, I'm not convinced that the country is really stable. And we saw just the other day, 2 days ago, there was an attack and 30-40 people were killed. But going back 20 years, it all started in 91. And when the former dictator of that country died, there was complete chaos. There was no government at all. And so there was civil war, action, tribes fighting against one another. And when things became very bad, the Security Council collective conscience was hurt, and they felt, we all felt, India was in the Security Council at this point in time. I happen to be India's ambassador and representative in the Security Council. You must all incidentally read my book, The Horseshoe Table, which gives you in detail how the Security Council handled or mishandled or did not handle those situations. But the first problem came. Mr. George Bush, the senior, he was in his last year of presidency. And thank you. And he thought that Somalia offered him a good opportunity to take strong action. And you know, Mrs. Thatcher at that time always used to goad Mr. Bush into being more energetic, don't be a wimp and so on. And so Somalia, Mr. Bush thought that here is something, here is a place where I can show my machoism. But he didn't want to do it unilaterally. He wanted Security Council blessings for that. And the Security Council happily gave him that endorsement. As I said, we are on the council, and one of the principles most sacrosanct for India and for all other developing or non-aligned countries is the principle of non-interference in internal affairs of the country. Now what was happening in Somalia was clearly its own business. How did it affect India for if the people were killing each other there? Or any other country for that matter. But then it was so blatantly unacceptable what was going on there. And truly innocent men, women and children were being massacred. So we all put aside our love or adherence to the principle of non-interference and said, yes, go ahead. Mr. Bush, if you want to go ahead and sort out the civil war, we have our full support. So Mr. Bush did that. He called it Operation Restore Hope. And he went in with Marines, large number of Marines, and brought the situation under reasonable control. But the problem starts with that moment, because the Security Council resolution which authorized Mr. Bush to go ahead, or the United States to go ahead, also said in that resolution that the authorization to do this to restore a secure environment in the country, a safe and secure environment in the country. Now our interpretation and the interpretation of Mr. Boutros Ghali, who is practical of this phrase, was that the United States must go and disarm all the militia. Because in the absence of taking away their arms, there was no, we all knew that the war will start again, the civil war will start again. So it was no point in just going and distributing food and medicine to the affected people. It was also essential to disarm the militias. But the Americans said, there is no way we are going to do that. We are not going to put our troops in the harm's way. So we will do this limited operation in Iraq, and after that it is up to you, United Nations, to do what you think needs to be done. And so because of that failure of the Americans, the country has not enjoyed peace for the last almost 25 years. So that was one glaring example of what has been termed as failure of the United Nations. Now, whether it was, as I said earlier, the failures are those of the United Nations, the successes are those of Americans and others. So, and other, even bigger disaster was Rwanda, where literally genocide did take place. We tend to use the word genocide rather loosely in common conversation, common parlance. Genocide has a very clear, very definite, very legal meaning. There is a genocide against, there is the International Convention against Genocide. And so it is defined very, very precisely. And in Rwanda, there was a systematic effort by the majority tribe called the Hutus to eliminate the minority tribe who are Tutsis. So it was a clear case of genocide, and the Americans refused to use that phrase genocide, the term genocide, because if they accepted, then consequences would follow, and they didn't want the consequences to follow, so they tried to avoid calling it genocide for a long time. But in the UN, we used it all the time, from the very beginning. Anyway, so Rwanda is an example of a massive failure of the United Nations, because depending on whose estimate you want to give credence to, 1 million people were killed, or 500,000 people were killed. A large number, hundreds of thousands were killed during this span of a few months. It was horrendous what happened. Why could not the UN prevent this? That is, why did the UN fail in Rwanda? When the trouble started in Rwanda, the the United Nations, the Security Council adopted a resolution asking the Secretary General to send a peacekeeping mission there. I don't want to go into all the details, but a mission was sent with some troops. We had some warning that the trouble was growing on a large scale, on a bigger scale, and the Secretary General asked for many more troops. In the absence of a significant number of troops, we cannot prevent what we see is coming. But the permanent members, the same permanent members who are now shouting about the so-called responsibility to protect, I'll come to that a little later, the same permanent members refused to authorize a meaningful peacekeeping force. And this was not a question of peacekeeping, now we're talking of peace enforcement under Chapter 7 of the Charter. And the Americans said that you have 500 troops, you can do what you can with that. There's no way you could do anything with 500. Eventually, number of troops was increased. We had an Indian battalion there. We were also running in Somalia, which did wonderful work in Somalia. Anyway, what happened in Rwanda. Bad things happened, and the United Nations has been blamed for that ever since. Though I would say Mr. Clinton, when he was president, had the decency to go to Rwanda and confess publicly the failure of his country and of the United Nations not to stand by the people of Rwanda. So that was a different thing for them to have done. Kofi Annan also. Kofi Annan was not Secretary General at the time, but he was the head of the peacekeeping division department. And many people also believe that he could have done better than he did in Rwanda. The last example, there are some others, but the third most prominent example is what I refer to as February, Bosnia. And there, horrendous things were happening in Bosnia. Bosnia, I'm sure as you know, consists of three so-called nationalities. Muslims, they are known as Bosniaks, and the Croats, and the Serbs. So in the Yugoslavia, they always called these groups as nationalities. And we don't use the word nationalities, for example, for the Tatas. We don't call them nations. But in Yugoslavia, the former undivided Yugoslavia, Mr. Tito's Yugoslavia, and we're going to have a lecture about President Tito, I see, later on. They are called nations and nationalities. So there are the three nationalities in Bosnia, but the Bosniaks or the Muslims are in the majority, and they wanted to have recognition for their state. But the other two, the Croats and the Serbs, were resisting that for various reasons. Then the serious threat developed to the Bosniaks or the Bosnian Muslims who lived in certain pockets. And we had a great ambassador in the Security Council from Venezuela, one called Diego Arias. And he was a little fellow, but very dynamic, full of energy. And he said that we must stop, we must do something. This business of doing something can sometimes help, very often it can lead to disaster. And the Srebrenica is an example of disaster. Often action taken with good intentions, but very, very, very badly resourced. So the Security Council passed a resolution declaring 6 such pockets in Bosnia as safe havens. So these are safe havens. And asked the Secretary General of the United Nations to go and protect these safe havens. No, but this time I was in the secretariat. I was the political advisor to the Secretary General, and we all discussed this matter. And we came to the conclusion that there is no way we can protect or defend the safe havens unless we are given enough manpower and financial resources. So the Secretary told the Security Council that if you want me to discharge this mandate properly, I need 36,000 soldiers, accompanied by adequate air force, artillery, and so on. So I still remember the British ambassador, Sir David Haney, in a small meeting, he said to Mr. Bhutto Ghali, you must be mad. Are you out of your mind? You expect us to give you 36,000 troops? Where are you going to get this 36,000 troops? And you know how much it's going to cost? Well, Bhutto Ghali said that this is my figure. If you want me to do this job, this is what I need. Then the Security Council said, give us some other options. And I think this is where the Secretary General made a mistake in my view. Perhaps he has to do this by the circumstances. And so he gave another option. He said, all right, if you give me 6,000 soldiers, I'll try my best. I do not know to what extent I can succeed, but I'll try. And we laid out some other conditions also. The member states must do this, must do that, and so on. So the council said, okay, you have 6,000. But it took 1 year for us to get those 6,000 soldiers. And the member states never gave tanks or armored personnel carriers and other equipment. Well, I'm leading up to now what is this massacre of Srebrenica. Because Srebrenica was a pocket where the Muslims, Bosnian Muslims were concentrated. And they were surrounded, the Serbs had laid a siege to that pocket. And they were pounding the pocket every day with artillery. And 10, 20, 30 people were getting killed every day. So the United Nations mandate was to go and help these people in the pocket. Of course, the United Nations could not do it because the 6,000 we had to protect 6 pockets. So Srebrenica had only 1,000 soldiers. And the Serbs were heavily armed. And also at the same time, the members they did not want their own troops, which were deployed under UN peacekeeping, to come in harm's way. On the one hand, you want to defend this pocket. On the other hand, they said, no, but our people must not get harmed. So it's an impossible mandate given. Well, with the result that the pocket fell to the Serbs, and the Serbs asked all the male population to stand outside in the fields, picked up all the boys and men, separated women. The women were sent back home, and all these were taken, and apparently 8,000 of them were mercilessly killed. Of course, the United Nations were blamed. And I don't blame them for blaming the United Nations because, as I said earlier, it is in popular mind, there is no distinction between the body, the United Nations, as such, and the members which compose the United Nations, they make up the United Nations. So that will forever remain a blot on the United Nations. Now, let me come to very recent times. I'm trying to wind up now. The subject is vast, and in the very recent times, the UN has failed its efforts in Darfur and in Sudan, where there is still no peace or stability. There is an African force which is doing its best, but Darfur is again brought on the name of the Security Council. Syria. According to UN estimates, by now 80,000 people have died in the Syrian civil war. But the international community is not able to do anything. And here is the classic example of the absence of unanimity among the P5. Because you all know that the Russians and the Chinese are not permitting the Security Council or the Western countries to adopt a more forceful resolution to declare a no-fly zone or whatever else. And the reason why the Soviets and the Russians and the Chinese and many countries like us are reluctant to let the Security Council authorize this thing is the example of Libya. Because last year in Libya, the Security Council did authorize some action to prevent loss of life and authorize no-fly zone, but this was abused by the Western countries, primarily France and Britain, for their own chauvinistic, nationalistic reasons. I don't personally believe that they care too much about the loss of life in Libya, just as they don't care for the loss of life in Syria. But for their own national reasons, they abused the authority given to them in Libya, and for that very reason, the Russians and the Chinese and many other countries are not prepared to let the Security Council be misused once again. So Syria is another example where the so-called international community is sitting tight and doing really nothing. Not only doing nothing, but actually doing a lot to fuel the civil war by giving arms, ammunition, money, resources, human power. They said manpower, I have to say manpower, because they're all men who are doing all these bad things in Syria, not women. So that's why the Syrian situation is a bad one. I'll say one or two words about this business of responsibility to protect, because it is very fashionable to talk about this concept. And some people have made a career on the R2P, as it is known. At first, this concept was known as humanitarian intervention. But the word intervention is not a happy phrase. So they changed it to responsibility to protect. It is the responsibility of the international community to protect people from their own government, basically. That is what it is all about. If innocent people are in a country are getting killed on a massive scale, and the government of the country are either unable or unwilling to protect those citizens, then the international community cannot stand by and watch such massacres taking place. And personally, I approve of the principle that in today's world, and in any period, in any time in the past, but especially today, in the times of social media and so on, the world cannot just look benignly and let thousands of people get massacred. We have to do something. So the principle is okay as far as it goes. For my problem, I have a big problem with this R2P business, which has now been made into a doctrine, the doctrine of responsibility to protect. So this has become a doctrinaire issue. As we all know, doctrinaire issues do not lend themselves to logical debate or discussion. But my problem is that even in the absence of this concept for doctrine, the Security Council was always able to act. And if it failed in Rwanda, it is not because of the absence of this so-called concept of R2P, but because member states, the same member states who are now talking loudly about R2P, did not let the United Nations function, carry out its mandate. So by evolving or concocting this concept, they have in fact made the concept much more controversial than it needed to be. Many countries like India, many others are not happy with this concept. Happily, I think it seems to me that this concept is on the decline now. Not much noise is being made about it, except the Gharekhan, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who's a man with a mission. He likes to have missions for which to combat, to fight. And so he dedicated himself to R2P for several years. Now I think he has seen that there is not much life left in it. So he's turned his attention to nuclear disarmament, to nuclear zero. And the Japanese are happy to finance such worthwhile projects. And Mr. Gharekhan, who is a sincere, committed, dedicated fellow, I'm not doubting his intention, but he's now fighting for nuclear zero. So much about the R2P. Now I'll end up, the only written text I have in my remarks is the conclusion. And so I beg your pardon, but I try to read out what I have drafted. The peoples of the world in whose name the United Nations was founded had great expectations of the organization. They believed in the simplicity and naive faith that the United Nations was an ideal, a perfect institution. They thought that their United Nations would right all wrongs, remove all injustices from the world, protect human rights of all, promote economic and social well-being, especially among the deprived sections of humankind, as is the case today. And especially because of what's going on in Syria. People have every right to question the credibility of this. What is the UN doing? What is Secretary Mr. Ban Ki-moon doing to stop this massacre in Syria? In the decade of the 1980s, the phrase retreat from multilateralism was much in vogue. That was unilateralism much more than multilateralism. The military intervention by the United States and others in Iraq in the spring of 2003 had an extremely damaging impact on the credibility of UN. According to a study conducted by the Pew Research Center after the Iraq War, positive views about the United Nations dropped by 37 points in Britain, 33 in Germany, and 28 in France. Majorities in non-aligned countries were negative about the United Nations, including, surprisingly, in Israel, where 63% Israelis had an unfavorable view of the United Nations. As of now, the image has taken another severe beating. Governments and peoples around the world have been shocked at the masterly inactivity of the Security Council and its failure to restore peace and stability in various parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. A less credible United Nations, however, does not necessarily mean a less relevant United Nations. The truth of the matter is that no country is prepared to give primacy to its commitment to the UN at the cost of its national interest. The Security Council is not a court of justice. It's an intergovernmental body where each country defends its interests and each country tries to use the Security Council or United Nations as an instrument of its own foreign policy. We try to do that. Every country does that. Some countries are more successful, like the United States, for example. Some countries are not so successful, like India, for example. If I remember, some of you might remember that there was a famous case of the Pan Am strike in 1990, where these two Libyans had hijacked the plane, had destroyed Lockerbie. And there was also a French plane at the same time that also had been destroyed. But it is mostly known as the Lockerbie affair. And the American and the Brits and the French came to the Security Council with a complaint and saying that the United Nations must impose sanctions against Libya. And we all asked for evidence. What is the evidence that Libya was involved? They said that we will give you a full dossier about the Libyan involvement. And wherever we, Mr. Narasimha Rao, the Prime Minister, he had come, we had a summit meeting of the Security Council, and we said, if we help you here, will you help us? Because remember, there were two Pakistanis who had hijacked an Indian Airlines plane. And I said, we have evidence that, these two did that crime. They said, no. These are different situations. You deal with that, you come and with your evidence, send it to our government, capital will examine it, but you can't link it to this one. And we decided to support. Firstly, because in our heart we knew that Libya had done it. And secondly, we knew that, we had hardly any chance of getting support from the Security Council on our issue. There has been a lot of credibility in India of the United Nations. So we all follow our national interests, but with all its faults and imperfections, I think the international community is better off with the United Nations than it would be without it. It has become a cliche, but it's true nevertheless to say that if there was no United Nations, one would have to be invented. So with all its imperfections, the United Nations does provide a forum where member states, especially towards small countries, can take the complaints. And if the big powers have no particular interest of their own in the matter which is brought by the small countries before the Security Council, then they will happily work together, the P5. It's only when their particular interests are affected that veto situation will come into play. The Chinese, for example, since the end of the Cold War, very cooperative. Of course, very often they follow the Russians, but they use veto only when the question of Taiwan in some form or the other comes up, because then they take a very hard position. And even if the 14 others support some resolution, the Chinese will veto that resolution. I think Ramaswamy Mudalia got it right at the founding conference of the United Nations. It is better to have an imperfect organization than none at all. Thank you for your attention.